If you like my content, join me on Patreon, where you can find more and exclusive novels. Also, you can leave a donation by clicking the Super Thanks button. Thank you very much for your support. Volume 8. First story. Enri's hectic, eventful life. Enri Emmett's day began early. She had to start preparing breakfast before the sun was even up. That was partly because she wasn't quite as used to the work as her deceased mother, so she took longer. The other part of it was that she had to make a huge amount of food. Cooking for Nemu, herself, and the 19 goblins who had sworn allegiance to Enri, 21 people, plus 2 more for a total of 23, meant she was beyond busy. Her situation was more aptly described as a battle. Enri could still hardly believe that the mountain of ingredients towering before her would vanish after a single meal. Well, it is 6 times larger than before, after all. Taking a deep breath, she rolled up her sleeves, ready to begin. She quietly chopped the vegetables, then switched knives and sliced the meat. The order of what needed to be handled was already decided. Enri had never been a very good cook, so her efficient preparation of so much in such a short time was a perfect illustration of what humans were capable of under pressure. The sound of Enri's cooking woke up her little sister, who wandered into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep out of her eyes. "Morning, Enri. I'll help." "Morning, Nemu. I'm fine here, so please do what I asked for yesterday." Nemu made a pouty face for a moment but ended up obeying with no complaints, offering a single okay before shuffling away. Enri stopped for a moment. Pain shot through her heart. Her 10-year-old sister used to be a lively girl who had no qualms about trying to get her way, but ever since the attack, her childlike innocence had faded, and she did exactly what Enri told her without so much as a peep. She'd become such a good girl it was depressing. Their parents' warm smiles flickered across Enri's mind. It had been several months since the attack, but the emotional scars hadn't completely healed. If it had been some sort of illness that claimed their lives, then at least she would have had time to prepare herself. Maybe the pain wouldn't have lingered so long had it been a freak accident or natural disaster that was nobody's fault, but the deaths of her parents were different. There was plenty of blame to lay. Enri squeezed her eyes shut. In front of the others, she did her best not to let any weakness show, but when there was no one around, her loneliness gouged at the scars in her heart. Yeah, behind her eyelids, she saw their kind parents. Even when she opened her eyes, they were still there. Touching memories filled her mind. Spurred by the dark spiral of emotions inside her, hatred for the people who killed their parents, she swung the carving knife with a mighty heave. Its momentum carved a clean slice through the meat. She furrowed her brow at the dent she'd inadvertently made in the cutting board. "I should know better. If the knife gets chipped, it'll be hard to fix." "Sorry, Mom." This was the knife she had mournfully inherited from her mother. She apologized for treating it carelessly and put a lid on the hole in her heart. As she was running her finger along the edge of the blade to make sure it wasn't chipped, the door next to her opened. The one who entered wasn't human, as evidenced by his small stature. It was a type of subhuman known as a goblin. "Good morning, boss lady. It's my turn today. Is something wrong?" The goblin bowed politely and looked at Enri's hands with concern. The goblin conducted himself as a subordinate, even though she was just a village girl, because she was the one who had summoned him. After the attack, when the villagers had been discussing how they should probably have lookouts, Enri suddenly remembered the item she had received, and when she used it, those goblins appeared. The villagers were shocked and frightened of the monsters, but when she explained that they were summoned with an item the village's savior, Sir Ainz Ooal Gown, had given her, they seemed to relax a little. It went without saying that the villagers trusted Ainz Ooal Gown. They were incredibly grateful to him, after all. The work the goblins had accomplished since then completely dispelled the villagers' remaining doubts. "Good morning, Kayari. I was being a little too aggressive with the knife." Kayari was one of the goblins who had been summoned. His worried face, furrowed brow, and all, seemed like it would be more appropriate on a man-eating bear whose hibernation had been interrupted. That won't do. Please be more careful. There's nobody with blacksmithing skills in this village, you know. We can't repair our gear, either. That's right, Kayari tried to be more cheerful, saying, well, we'll figure something out eventually, and set about helping to cook breakfast. He took smoldering embers out of a pot he'd brought and lit the oven with a practiced hand. His skill was clear from the way the tiny flame rapidly grew into a roaring fire. But he can't cook. I wonder why. The goblins couldn't make even simple dishes themselves. At first, she thought it was because their diet consisted of raw meat and vegetables, but it turned out they preferred cooked food. Of course, they would still eat something whether it was prepared or not, but maybe summoned creatures can't cook? Well, I'm just a village girl, so how am I supposed to know? Having reached that conclusion, she concentrated on her work. Luckily, the knife hadn't chipped. Before long, the two were done cooking. There was a lot more food on the table compared to when her mother had been cooking for the family. For one thing, there was meat. Of course, back then, her family had received a share of meat the rangers sometimes brought back, but it wasn't nearly as much as they had now. The increase was due to the village operating across a larger swathe of territory these days. The surrounding Tove woodlands provided them with the bounties of the forest, firewood, edible fruits and vegetables, animal meat and skins, as well as all sorts of herbs. One could call it a mountain of riches, but monsters lived in the forest as well. Since the villagers didn't want to risk leading them back to their homes, they hadn't really been able to lay a hand on any of the resources up until now. Back in those days, the best they managed had been sending in specialists with experience and confidence in their hunting skills to steal some of the riches outside the wise king of the forest's territory. But now, after the appearance of the goblins and the absence of the wise king of the forest, the situation had changed quite a lot. The villagers were now able to enter the forest and freely harvest the bounties of nature. The efforts of their new, powerful friends were magnificent, giving them access to meat that had been so difficult to obtain before. Fresh fruits and vegetables also showed up with more regularity on their tables. The village's diet improved dramatically. And since the goblins were understood to be serving under Enri, her house had the first pick of any game they hunted. A ranger who had joined the village recently also contributed to the improvement of their food situation. She used to be an adventurer in Erantal. Ever since she moved to the village, she had been working with the rangers and improving as a hunter. Since she used to be a warrior, she was great with a bow and could take down large prey. That also increased the frequency that meat was available. The better nutrition naturally affected Enri's body. She flexed her arm for a moment. It made quite a respectable bulge. I feel like I'm getting bigger and bigger lately. The goblins probably meant to praise her by saying things like, "You're putting on muscle lately, let's power up some more, you're getting some good definition there, aim for that six-pack, lookin' sharp." But as a woman it was a bit, or perhaps quite, complicated. I haven't bulked up as much as the goblins hope I will, but I'd really rather not. Envisioning the ultimate form of herself that the goblins were hoping for, she quickly chased the image out of her mind as she began plating food on the table. This was another pain. There wouldn't be a fuss over slightly unequal portions, but whether there was meat in someone's soup or not could turn into a huge problem. She confirmed that every bowl contained the same amount and ratio of ingredients as she went along. Soon, right about the time the sweat started rolling down her forehead, she was finished preparing breakfast. Okay, we have to get the other goblins and NFI. Yeah, that's right. I'll go call them. When she turned around, Nemu was standing there, eyes sparkling. Did you finish everything I asked you to do? Enri nodded when she saw her sister nod. You did? Then go get NFI and, no, I'll go get the goblins. Nemu interrupted her older sister with a sudden shout, but Enri didn't have any objections. When Kayari bobbed his head at her, it must have been in thanks. Okay, thanks. Then I guess I'll go get NFI. That's a good idea. I'll go with ya, boss lady. No one would be left in the house, but that wasn't an issue. Enri had never heard of any burglaries in the village. Enri took Kayari with her and set out after Nimu. A breeze carrying the scents of the meadow blew over her as she walked in the morning sunlight. As she deeply breathed in the fresh air, she saw Kayari was doing the same. She smiled in spite of herself, and when Kayari noticed, his face twisted into an evil sneer. There was a time when Enri might have been terrified, but after living together as long as they had, she knew for sure that this was a happy expression. Enri enjoyed the pleasant weather as she headed for the house next door. One of the houses that ended up empty after the recent tragedy was currently occupied by the Balar family, formerly apothecaries in Eventful. There were two in their household, the master apothecary Lizzie Balar and her grandson, Enri's friend Enri Balar. Both of them were holed up in their home, steeping herbs and creating medicines. Not participating in communal village life was considered poor behavior that meant being kept at an arm's length, or in the worst case, completely ostracized, but the Baliers were different. The work of an apothecary, making medicines in case someone became sick or injured, was indispensable in a small village like this one. As long as they made medicines, no one would ask any more of them. The need for an apothecary was felt especially keenly in a village like Karn, where there was no resident priest who could use healing magic. Incidentally, in slightly larger settlements, priests often served as local apothecaries as well. When priests used healing magic, they asked for the appropriate fee in return. In fact, they had to. But in the event villagers weren't able to pay, they were compensated with labor. The priests would use herbs to make medicines for people who still couldn't pay. Treatments done with herbal remedies cost less than magic healing. There was a cleric among the goblins who could close up small cuts in an instant, but the villagers all agreed that they should save his power to deal with serious injuries. Still, there were limits. The few spells the cleric knew didn't include any that could cure sickness or poison. For that reason, everyone was thankful the Balar family stayed inside their house and devoted themselves to making medicines. Despite the fact that they did such important work, almost no one in the village went anywhere near them. The reason for that became clear upon approaching the house. Enri scrunched up her nose. Kayari did the same thing, only in a more menacing fashion. A nasty, pungent smell hung in the air all around the Balar house. It practically seemed toxic. Herbs sometimes gave off sharp odors when crushed, but there was at least something fresh and natural to them. They didn't produce dangerous smells like this one. Exhaling through her mouth, Enri knocked on the door. After knocking a few times, she began to think that they might be out. At that very moment, she sensed someone moving on the other side. An instant later, the lock clicked and the door opened. She wanted to keep a straight face and not say anything, but she couldn't handle the air that wafted out. It hurt. The powerful stench assaulted her eyes, nose, and mouth. It smelled so bad it made the air outside feel like a mild side effect. "Morning, Enri." The eyes peeking through a gap in Faria's long bangs were open but terribly bloodshot. He must have stayed up all night working on his alchemy again. She didn't want to open her mouth with that stink in the air, but it would be rude not to return his greeting. "Morning, NFI." Her throat felt scratchy for a moment. "Good morning, boss man." "Good morning, Kayari." "I guess it's morning. I was concentrating so hard I didn't notice, but since the sun's already so. Time sure flies. I was doing experiments all night, so I'm kinda tired," he yawned audibly. "Seems like you were really focused on your work. Breakfast is ready, so call your grandmother and come with me," she wanted to say, but Faria interrupted her. "Well, probably not on purpose." He was just so excited. "It's amazing, Enri." He leaned in. The horrible odor permeated his work clothes, and she wanted to keep some distance, but she was his friend, so she suppressed the urge to back away. "What is, Faria?" "Listen." We've finally succeeded in producing a potion using a new process. This is totally groundbreaking. We're mixing the solution we were given with herbs, and the potion we get turns out purple. All she could do was sigh. She had no idea what part of that was amazing. Is it like if you put purple cabbage in some water? And it really does close-up wounds. The healing speed is on par with potions made with alchemical items alone. Enri rolled up his sleeve to show off the lack of cuts on his slim arm. While Enri thought his arm might be skinnier than mine, he continued talking. And so? Okay, please leave it at that. Kayari stepped abruptly forward. You're on a high from lack of sleep, you know? Boss lady, you can leave this to me, so why don't you head back first? Are you sure? Not a problem. I'll throw some water in his face and whatnot to calm him down, then we'll be right over. If you're late getting back, everyone worry, right? What about Grandma, by the way? She's still focused on her experiments. I have the feeling she won't eat breakfast. Sorry, I know you worked hard to make it, that's fine. I sort of figured Lizzie might not eat. This had happened several times before, so it was no surprise. Alright, boss lady, please head on back. If he was going to put it like that, she had no choice but to obey. Okay, thanks, then. With one eye on Enri's receding figure, Kayari gave Enri a cold look. What do you think you're doing? Don't you know women only pay attention to men talking about their hobbies when they like them? If a man talks about his hobbies with a woman who's not in love with him, it drives her away. Sorry. It's just that this amazing thing happened, so. I mean, it's so amazing. Groundbreaking. Enri clearly hadn't learned his lesson, and Kayari interrupted with a sigh and a wave of his hand. Are you sure you're okay there? You're in love with the boss lady, right? Enri gulped and nodded an emphatic yes. Then prioritize her over your medicines. Okay. I'll try. Trying's not good enough. You have to do it. You have to get her to fall for ya. We're with ya all the way. Not only that, but her little sister promised to cooperate, too. You need to get it together. Yeah, if you wait for her to say she likes ya, she'll probably be carried off by some other guy first. You need the courage to speak up. Enri felt like a sharp knife had plunged into his chest. Well, I'm kinda slamming ya, but I know you're doing your best, boss man. Before, you could hardly even squeeze out a word, and now you having conversations on the regular. Back then, I didn't get to see her very often. It was only when I came here to gather herbs. I've definitely spent more time with her since moving here than all the previous times combined. That's the spirit, that's the spirit. Just keep forging ahead. First, we need to call attention to your strength. I asked a lady in the village, and sure enough, women fall for strong guys. She was 49, but I'm not too confident when it comes to muscles. Should I help out in the fields more? No, you have one of these. Kayari poked his head to drive the point home. Fight with that. I was thinking magic might be good, too. But look, when me or one of the others thinks you have a chance to sell yourself, we'll pose like this. When we do that, say or do something that'll make her fall for ya. Kayari struck a pose that showed off his bulging biceps. This, got it? Then if we think you should keep pushing, we'll pose like this. Next, he showed off his chest. The goblin was small, but had the sturdy body of a warrior. Why the poses? Enri thought, but he could see they meant well, so he couldn't bring himself to wonder aloud. He did have to ask one thing, though. So hey, why are you guys doing this for me? I know you're devoted to Enri, but I can't figure out your motive for helping me. What a basic question, Kayari answered in exasperation and continued in a clear, slow manner that others might use to explain something to a small child. We want the boss lady to be happy. From that point of view, you're the goal. So you guys need to get married as soon as possible. We don't have to rush, though. We could just gradually grow closer, you know? That'll be too late. It takes time from when a human gets pregnant till when they have the baby, right? When the conversation reached what was arguably the ultimate form of heterosexual relations, Enri blinked a few times, and his face reddened slightly. Yeah. I guess it takes about 9 months. So then you won't have enough time to have 14, 10. 10? I think that's a bit much. The average number of children for a farmer was 5. In rough environments where it was expected that some wouldn't make it to adulthood, the average rose a little, while in places where priests could heal the sick or in the city where contraceptives were available, it decreased slightly. For one woman to have 10 children was a bit much. What are you talking about? For a goblin, that's normal. We're not goblins. Well, there might be some difference between races, but you want her to have lots of babies and be happy, right? I can't say for sure that having lots of babies wouldn't make her happy, but something feels off. Kayari had cocked his head, but Enri didn't feel like responding. Overall, he was grateful for their support. Okay, let's go. For now, I'd like you to make some kind of move, at least. If you end up too much like family, it'll be hard to take things to the next level. But, well, that might be the slow route. Where do you guys come up with all this? Enri shook his head. Hey, Grandma, I'm going to Enri's for breakfast. Are you coming? A declining voice answered his call into the house. She would probably be experimenting the whole time. Stopping to eat would be a waste. He understood her feelings, to a painful degree. The various alchemical items and instruments in this house were all highly advanced. The correct way to use most of them completely eluded the pair. A maid serving the caster Ainz Ooal Gown had delivered the tools, saying he and his grandma should use them to make new potions and alchemical items. She also brought other things, like a legendary herb purported to heal any and all ailments. When they asked how to use the solutions, other materials, and unfamiliar instruments, the maid only said, "Think for yourselves," so they were left with no clue how to proceed. That's why they had been working without anything that even bore a passing resemblance to a break, conducting every kind of experiment they could think of. They were sure they were making progress, even if each step forward was slow, and even if they sometimes encountered major setbacks. It had probably been the most intense 2 months of Enri's life, naturally, but also Lizzie's. The final fruit of that labor was a purple potion on the table, which completely absorbed Lizzie's attention and caused Enri to lose himself in the excitement. I'll go get some for you, then, Grandma. Having said that, Enri closed the door and turned to Kayari. Shall we go? Even if they wanted to wait until everyone arrived to start eating, Enri's house wasn't big enough to hold them all. For that reason, if the weather was cooperative, they took their meals outdoors. Doing it this way meant that a bit of a ruckus was tolerable, too. If everyone had been inside, Enri's patience would have dried up sooner. Still, it was too loud. So this is what I'm saying, boss lady's gonna be my wife. Hey, did you forget our agreement that you wouldn't aim for her? Yeah. If you're gonna make a move, then so am I. What? I'm first. Several goblins kicked aside their chairs and stood up. A few others jumped onto the table. Enri held her anger back and called out to them kindly. Please calm down, everyone. But the fire in the goblins' eyes wouldn't be extinguished. Struggling is futile, brothers. This game's already been decided. Behold this gleaming meat. Enshrined on the spoon one of the goblins, Kunaru, held aloft was a piece of chicken that at first glance resembled a bean. It was so small that Enri couldn't be blamed for missing it or not recognizing it as meat while she was trying to serve equal portions. I ate my meat already, but I found more at the bottom of my bowl. Did you guys have any extra meat in your bowls? You didn't, did you? In other words, this is love. Gimme a break. She just mistook it for a bit of vegetable. Or maybe you're just imagining things? What you ate before was actually a potato, and the only meat you got was that puny nub. Careful, you might creep her out. Remember, our God says, thou shalt make Enri happy. Your God is probably an evil one, Kona. Half the goblins got up, and the rest cheered and heckled them on from their seats. Nemu was one of the hecklers. A few people remained outside these groups and focused on the table. Nfiria was a prime example. Ruby powder, magic feathers, a pestle made into Nelico, a mortar, a mo, a more. He was mumbling something vacantly while working his spoon, so as soon as he put soup in his mouth, it returned to his plate. His hair covered his eyes, but his gaze was likely flitting between the real world and a fantasy. NFI, are you okay? If she didn't do something about the goblins, she wasn't sure how heated their argument would get, but Nfiria was acting strange, so she couldn't leave him alone either. He probably hadn't slept in a long time. The moment he had sat down, his focus fractured even more, scattering in every direction. By the time they started eating, he was missing so much vitality and intelligence it was like an undead had joined the table. Yes, K. Enri, soup, NFI. Wake up. Weren't you the one who was saying, Nemu for life? Things are different now. Nemu is 10 and about as tall as us, so I thought she was a young lady. Then I learned that humans apparently aren't considered adults until they're 15. Are you serious? So Boss Lady and the others aren't hop humans or something? The goblin's boisterous conversation moved along quickly. Enri was about to ask what a hop human was, but they grew tired of teasing and happened upon a new argument. You stole my bread. My wolf is hungry. Don't be stingy. Everyone. Enri raised her voice only to be drowned out by the clamor. Spoons and plates flew even as shouts and jeers raged. They were throwing empty dishes, so no food went to waste, but it still wasn't behavior that she could let slide. Enri finally steeled her resolve, furrowed her eyebrows, and inhaled. Pretty sure wolves are carnivorous. You might be higher level, but don't kid yourself about how you'd fare in a real melee battle. Very interesting. How about I remind you what you had for dinner last night? The moment Enri leaped to her feet, they all returned to their seats in a single wave of motion and began eating politely. Would you please quiet down? Her shout reverberated around the silent table. She looked about blankly. They all wore faces that said, we were just quietly eating breakfast. Something wrong? And you're disturbing us with your sudden outburst. After a moment of stillness, Enri blushed and sat down heavily. The first one to break the silence was Nemu. Then Enri cracked up, holding her stomach, and the goblins practically fell out of their chairs laughing. Their timing had been amazing. They had probably planned it all out in detail at a meeting beforehand, maybe even rehearsed. It was hilarious that they would put so much earnest effort into something so silly. It's too funny. Were you all aiming for that from the beginning? She'd laughed so hard that she was still wiping tears out of the corners of her eyes while she asked, pretending to be annoyed. Of course, Boss Lady. We'd never make such a big fuss about things like that. What he said, ma'am. Quite right, quite right. They bragged and frustrated her line of questioning with their usual jokey grins, not a hint of guilt on their faces. But Enri narrowed her focus to Kayari and stared at him. He seemed to grow uncomfortable and averted his eyes before mumbling an evasive answer. Well, I guess, you seemed kind of down this morning, Boss Lady. You guys, after all, we're your bodyguards. That's right. Yeah, we're your bodyguards. We even came up with a pose for when we appear on the scene. Oh yeah, so we put you and Nemu in the middle like this, what? Me too? Of course. Then you raise your arms majestically, like this. Even describing it in the kindest way possible, he seemed like a frog tipped over on its back. I'll pass, I think. I don't really know what you mean by bodyguards in the first place. NFI, don't you think it's a little She turned to her old friend for help, but no one was there. On a hunch, she lowered her eyes and found him sprawled on the table face down in his soup. NFI. Her face went pale as she shouted and picked him up. Kona rushed over at once and pried the exhausted Enfiria's eyes open with his fingers. He's only sleeping. If we let him sleep till around noon, he'll be fine. NFI. What'll we do with you? She piggybacked him and set off for a bedroom in her house where she would let him sleep. She could hear voices behind her. Isn't it normally the other way around? Let's not say anything, Nimu. Boss man, once the village harvested the wheat, the tax collector would come to the village. Enri wondered how she would explain the goblins. Should I just say we summoned them? Maybe I can call them my underlings? Or... Enri thought about how they were always being considerate of her. They didn't merely protect her, but also understood her feelings. She wondered what she could do for them. The goblins were pretty noisy, but they were reliable, too. They were her new family, there had to be something she could do for them. Enri wiped the sweat dripping down the nape of her neck with the clean back of her hand as she gathered up the weeds she had pulled out. There were quite a lot, and the crushed grass gave off a green smell. After hours out in the field, her sweat-soaked clothes clung to her. She felt gross and tired. She stretched her back to refresh her mood. Spreading out before her was a field. The heads of the wheat plants she'd sown were filling out. As the harvesting season drew closer and closer, the wheat would turn gold. It was quite a sight when the entire field turned completely golden, but before that, she had to perform the chore of weeding. If she didn't take care of the weeds before then, the color wouldn't be as fine. Now was the time for that suffering. Stretching her back helped relieve some tension and stiffness. Her body was warm from working the field, and the breeze blowing past felt great. The gust brought something else to her, noise from the village. She could hear something being hammered, as well as chants to help teams of laborers focus, all things she had never heard in the village before. They were currently working on a variety of different projects. The most important was the building of a wall and a watchtower. It went without saying that this was to further fortify the village. Karn was near the Tove woodlands. The forest was a threatening place where monsters dwelled. It was impossible to live safely near an area like that without sturdy fortifications. But their village, with houses lined up on level ground and a square in the middle, didn't have anything that could be called defenses. Anyone could walk right in. Their arrangements had worked fine for a while, because although they were near the woodlands, no monsters came near them. That was thanks to the wise king of the forest's territory in the forest. No monsters would traverse its domain, so the villagers were as safe as if they had been protected by an iron wall. But that safeguard was undone by human hands. Imperial knights had attacked the settlement, killing their loved ones. No one thought they would be safe any longer as they were. That was why the goblin leader Jujumu's proposal to fortify the village, he mentioned they might not be able to protect everyone if they came under attack again, was adopted unanimously. They were still tormented by unforgettable nightmares. First, they broke down houses no one was living in anymore and appropriated the wood for the wall. Obviously, that wasn't enough, so they needed to cut down some trees from the woodlands. If they went deep into the woods, they ran the risk of entering the wise king of the forest's territory, so they skirted along the edge. The goblins, naturally, served as their escorts. Through all this cooperation, the villagers' wariness of the goblins virtually disappeared. Perhaps the knights being fellow humans who killed the villagers was a contributing factor. Their own kind had robbed them of their lives and loved ones. In contrast, the goblins, despite being a different race, worked under Enri to help the village. In other words, it wasn't right to place trust in others based on whether they were from the same race or not. Most of all, the goblins were powerful. Goblin warriors posted as lookouts, and even if they got hurt, the goblin cleric Kona would heal them. It was hard to dislike them when they were so nice. Thus, in a few short days, the goblins put down roots in the village and became an irreplaceable presence there. One glance at their house was enough to understand. Despite belonging to a different race, they were living in a big new house built for them right near Enri's. The villagers and the goblins worked together on the defense plan, but unfortunately they were short on hands, so at first they'd been able to build only a simple fence. It was at precisely that point that the wise king of the forest, who had been acting as a breakwater for the village, abandoned its territory to follow a masterful warrior in black armor. Everyone had worked so hard to finish the fence and then had to lament that it would never be enough to keep them safe. But now they were protected by a great wall. Things had taken a turn for the better when a peerless beauty, who said she was one of the village's savior Ainz Ooal Gown's maids, brought some stone golems to their homes. Golems were strangers to exhaustion that silently followed orders, and possessed far more power than humans. Since they were a little clumsy, the golems couldn't be trusted with detailed work, but their help shortened building times by an unbelievable degree. With golems working without sleep or rest, the construction of the wall advanced rapidly. It would have been impossible for the villagers and the goblins to perform such a vast amount of labor on their own, but the golems finished it, felling a huge number of trees, digging the gigantic hole to properly sink the foundation, and the wall that would normally take several years to complete was built in a few days. Moreover, it was longer, taller, and sturdier than originally planned. They made progress on not only the wall, but the lookout towers as well. Thanks to that, the village had towers in both the east and west. "Boss lady, I'm done over here, too." Enri's thoughts were interrupted when Pipo, the goblin who was weeding with her, called out. "Thank you. No need." Pipo waved her off while his hands were still filthy with dirt and plant juices, but she didn't feel like she could ever thank him enough. It was hard for her to maintain her house's fields after losing her mother and father. Normally someone from the village would help, but with the dearth of workers, everyone had their hands full with their own fields. But when the goblins started helping her, the problem was solved. And Enri wasn't the only one getting assistance. Enri heard someone calling for her and turned around to find a plump woman standing there. Next to her was a goblin. "Enri, dear. Thanks so much. I finished up my field with the help of Mr. Goblin." "That's great." Everyone volunteered to cooperate. "Please thank them directly." "I thanked Mr. Goblin already. He said they're just underlings and wanted me to thank their boss lady." Enri's face twinged at the mention of boss lady, but she turned it into a grin. The goblins had offered to help out households who'd lost workers in the attack. The woman before her was from one such family. Who could begrudge such considerate goblins? They were better neighbors than some of the humans in Karn. Naturally, those sorts of stories got around and had resulted in everyone's current high opinion of the little monsters. "By the way, where are the other goblins? I thought I'd treat them to a meal as a thank you." "The others are either working security or helping out the new arrivals, but I'll let them know." "Well then, please pass the message along, Enri, dear. I'll make something special. I suppose I'll treat this one now." "Really? Then I humbly accept your offer." "Sorry, boss lady, but I'll be over at Mrs. Mulger's." When Enri nodded, the woman and the goblin next to her set off walking back toward the village. "I just hope all the people who agreed to move here will understand that you're not evil. They looked pretty spooked when we first laid eyes on one another." "It seems like they'd counted us among their enemies," replied Pipo. "I guess in other frontier villages, it's normal to consider subhumans enemies. That's why we're offering to help out so much. It's tricky, though. But they're coming around, aren't they? A little while ago, I saw someone say hello like normal." "Well, the transplants have memories just like the people here do of being attacked and having their families killed. No, maybe their burdens are even heavier." Karn's fate was brutal, but even so, about half the villagers survived. Some villages had almost their entire populations killed by the knights. The people who had responded to Karn's call for new settlers were survivors from those villages. A silence fell upon the pair. Enri gave her back another good stretch and looked up at the sky. The noon bell hadn't rung yet, but it was almost time, and she was at a good stopping point in her field work. Okay, should we have lunch? She was familiar enough with Pipo's squashed-looking face to see that he'd put on a cheerful smile. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Your cooking is delicious, boss lady. No, it's not. She laughed, blushing. No, really. Competition for the job of helping you in the field is fierce, 'cause we all want to eat your tasty food. Then why don't I just make food for everyone? Like we do at breakfast. Cooking for 2 was the same as cooking for 20, or not. Cutting up the ingredients for that many portions was a job in and of itself. 1 or 2 pots would never be enough. It would take quite a lot of work. But when she considered how much she owed the goblins, it didn't feel like any trouble at all. No, that's okay. Eating your food is a perk for the one who beats out the competition. Enri smiled at the little grinning subhuman, not sure what to do. She knew the goblins had been playing rock paper scissors to decide who got to help her, but she wasn't sure her cooking was worthy of such a fuss. Okay, shall we head back and eat? Sounds good. Having said that much, Pipo suddenly shut his mouth and looked into the distance with his keen eyes. Enri gasped at the stark shift from funny little subhuman to seasoned warrior and followed his gaze. There was a goblin riding a black wolf, seemingly gliding across the meadow toward the village. It's Kumei. The goblin troop Enri had summoned comprised 12 level 8 goblins, 2 level 10 goblin archers, 1 level 10 goblin mage, 1 level 10 goblin cleric, 2 level 10 goblin riders, and 1 level 12 goblin leader, for a total of 19. Kayari, who she had seen that morning, and Pipo, who had been helping her in the field, were level 8 goblins, while a level 10 goblin rider, Kumei, was coming toward them now in furry leather armor mounted on a pitch-black wolf. The goblin riders were tasked with riding around the meadow and acting as an early warning system. It was common to see them return to the village for regular reports. Yeah. But Pipo's voice was tense. Something wasn't sitting right with him. That was the feeling she got. What's wrong? It's a little early. He was supposed to be on watch out toward the woodlands. Did something happen? Hearing Pipo's explanation, Enri felt worry well up inside her, fear that another bloody attack was nearing. As the pair watched in silence, the large wolf carrying Kumei raced toward them. The wolf's ragged breaths spoke volumes about how hard they must have rushed over. What is it? In response to Pipo's question, Kumei, still on his wolf, bobbed his head to Enri and answered, Something seems to have happened out near the woodlands. Something? I don't really know. It's not like before when a big bunch of guys were heading north. Do you mean knights? Enri interrupted without thinking. Even though she knew she couldn't be of any use in this situation, she had to ask. She couldn't shake the fear from the day the village was attacked. The other group the goblins mentioned had numbered in the thousands, leaving tracks behind as they headed north. The footprints were human size, but since they had apparently been barefoot, the goblins concluded they weren't human. I'm not sure, but I don't think it's knights. It seems more like something's happened deep in the woods. She sighed in relief without really meaning to. Well, for now I'll report in to our leader. All right. Nice work. Thank you. They waved, and Kumei ran off astride his wolf. They watched him go until they saw him slip through the slowly opened village gate. Well, shall we go back? Yeah. After washing up at the well, Enri and Pipo arrived home and a young girl's voice called out to them. Welcome back, Enri. Along with the greeting, they heard the scraping noise of 2 rocks grinding together. When they looked, it was Nemu using the stone mill in the shade of the house. The pungent smell that prickled Enri's nose was wafting from the mill. It resembled the aroma that had been clinging to her hands earlier, but was twice as strong, enough to pick up even from a distance. Nemu was already used to it, so it must not have been a problem for her, but when it hit Enri, tears sprang into the corners of her eyes. Nothing in particular happened to Pipo's expression behind her, although it wasn't clear if a racial trait had spared him or whether he simply thought it would be rude to make a strange face in front of his master's younger sister. "We're back. How'd it go? Did you get them crushed properly?" "Yep, perfect. Look." Nemu eyed her results with a satisfied smile. Of the mound of herbs that had been there when Enri went out, only a tiny few were left. "Amazing, right? I'm practically done." Nemu had been turning the herbs into a paste and stuffing them into a jar the way Enri had requested. Most herbs were stored by either drying or grinding them up, depending on the type. "Wow, you worked hard, Nemu." In response to Enri's unreserved praise, Nemu looked a bit proud but also blushed. At some point, she had either been trained by Enri, or perhaps she had simply decided she wanted to help her sister out, but her work had improved, becoming both thorough and swift. Herbs were an important source of revenue for Karn. It took a lot of work to live in a frontier village, and this was arguably their home's only specialty product. It was an indispensable way of acquiring money, so the villagers knew where to find abundant clusters of all different sorts of herbs. Enri thought to herself quietly. This herb boasted one of the best profits out of all the various types that the villagers foraged. But because the plants developed medicinal properties only right before they flowered, they could be relied on for only supplemental income. The villagers had already picked clean all the clusters they knew about, but it was possible that if they pushed a little farther into the forest, there were still untouched clusters. But of course, monsters stalked the woodlands. Enri couldn't just stroll in as if she was going on a picnic. But now she had the goblins alongside her, plus Enri, who had a wealth of experience gathering herbs. If she asked for their help, they would probably be able to earn a nice bit of money. After hesitating for a moment, Enri broached the topic with Pipo. "I'd like to go gather herbs in a new spot. Would you come with me?" Really, there was no reason Enri herself needed to go. She could have theoretically sent the more competent goblins of their ranks into the dangerous woodlands on their own, if only the goblins she summoned hadn't come with a peculiar shortcoming. They were bad at looking for herbs and butchering animals they had hunted. It was similar to how none of them could cook. Enri could show them an herb, but they couldn't find another of the same variety even if it was right in front of their noses. It puzzled her, but they simply lacked those abilities. Moreover, there was no sign that they had the ability to learn or acquire those skills. It was almost as if they were erased from their memories. As a result, when it came to gathering herbs, someone had to go with the goblins. "I don't mind going, but it might be a little tricky to have you come along." "What? Really?" "Yeah, wasn't Kumei just talking about how something might have happened deep in the forest? During times like that, the woods get agitated." Enri looked confused, so Pipo explained in detail. "Cautious monsters will sometimes shift their territory. When that happens, neighboring territories get jumbled up temporarily, and it causes all sorts of confusion. To put it simply, you're more likely to run into a monster, and the forest becomes more dangerous. If you're unlucky, you might even come across monsters outside the woods. No matter how daring you are, there's no need to leap directly into danger, is there?" "I see." Enri wondered if she was actually daring, but she chalked it up as more of the goblins' usual flattery and let it go. It seemed like there was a big migration before, too. "Something must be going on, I don't know." "I really don't. I'd like to send some guys into the woods to do a detailed investigation, but if we leave, there won't be as many people to protect the village." "How about sending adventurers?" "That would be tough." Enri frowned. "NFI told me it costs a lot of money to hire adventurers. Supposedly, the Lord in Irantal would cover part of the cost, but it'd be hard for us to cover even just our share. Maybe if we were able to forage and sell a lot of herbs, it would work out, but our only other option would be to sell that item Sir Gown gave us, Ainz Ooal Gown had given her 2 horns. She had used one, but the other she still had hidden in her house. "Don't do that, boss lady. If it came to that, it'd be better to blow it." "No, of course I won't sell it." She didn't want to be the low sort of person who would pawn off a generous gift. Even if it reached the point where they were in trouble, if she didn't sell it, she would still be against it. She especially didn't want to do anything so ungrateful when Ainz Ooal Gown continued to be so concerned for the village that he had sent over a maid with golems. But what a dilemma. "We can only gather these herbs during this time, so even if it's a bit dangerous, I'd really like to go if possible." Enri smiled at Nemu, who seemed nervous. She wanted to avoid doing anything that would upset her last remaining family member, but she would hate missing out on a chance to earn some precious cash. Maybe her priorities were a little out of order, but she needed to pay her debt to the people who put their lives on the line for the village, the ones who considered her their master. "I need to make a pile of money and see what I can do to buy the goblins new gear. Full plate or whatever seemed like it had good defense." That black armor person, what was her name again? She had no idea how much weapons and armor cost, but it had to be quite a hefty sum. That was precisely why Pipo held out a steadying hand when she looked so determined to rush ahead. "Well, it's just my opinion. I'll ask our leader about it, so don't make any hasty decisions. I don't want to get scolded for claiming some half-baked idea, and I bet the boss man would also like to get his hands on all sorts of herbs." Just as Enri was wondering what to do, she heard a cute little rumbling noise. When she looked up, Nemu was shooting her a dissatisfied look. "I'm hungry, Enri. Let's eat." "Yeah, sorry. Clean this up and wash your hands. I'll make lunch." "Okay." With a cheerful reply, Nemu took apart the mill and used a spatula to transfer the green goop inside to a little pot. Enri headed for the entrance to the house, thinking, "I wonder what I should make." Enri stood just outside the Tove woodlands. Of course, she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by all the members of her loyal goblin troop. The goblins had donned mail shirts and round shields, while thick machetes hung at their hips. On the other side were slung pochettes to carry small items. They also wore brown shorts and sturdy shoes fashioned from furry animal pelts. They weren't missing anything in terms of gear. The fully outfitted goblins were going over their kit one final time. They checked that their water skins were full and their machetes sharp. The reason they were so well equipped but packed lightly was that they planned to finish their business quickly rather than spend hours exploring the forest. They weren't all there as escorts for Enri. Their main objective was to do a detailed investigation on the news the writer had brought. They wanted to find out what had occurred in the woodlands. Still, all they needed to do was protect the village, so they decided to explore more broadly in the settlement's vicinity rather than plunge into the forest depths. Only 3 goblins would go gathering with Enri. Nfiria was also with her. He was all ready to go, wearing clothes suitable for picking herbs in the forest. With him along, they would certainly be able to collect what they needed. He must have sensed her gaze. He cocked his head as if to ask, "What?" She waved her hands to show that she had nothing particular in mind, but he still must have been worried, because he walked over accompanied by a large goblin. The goblin had such a hulking physique that it was hard to believe he was the same race. He wore a heavy-duty, roughly fashioned breastplate and carried a well-used great sword on his back. This was Juggimu, the goblin leader whom Enri had named after the goblin hero Juggimu. Incidentally, all the knights who fought alongside that hero had special names, and she had given those names to the rest of the goblins. "You don't seem worried, but is something wrong?" "No, I'm fine, really. I just happened to look at you." "That's all right, then, but remember that even a little thing can get you killed in the woods. If anything seems off, let me know." "He's right, boss lady. Like I said before, we're gonna be checking out the forest, so we won't be able to come to your rescue so quick. Will you be all right?" Juggimu twisted his craggy face into a worried look and peered at Enri. In response, Enri smiled. I'll be fine. I'm not going that far in, and these guys will protect me. If you say so, he eyed each of the goblins she was looking at in turn. Then he raised his voice. Well, you guys probably already know this, but don't let the boss lady get so much as a scrape. The three goblins, going with her, Goku, Kayari, and Enri, gave a lively reply. And boss man, I'm counting on ya, too. Enri noticed Kayari was doing a front double biceps pose for some reason. So now's a good time to do something? Of course. I'll protect Enri. Enri hallucinated a sparkle in Faria's teeth as he laughed, brimming with confidence. It was so unlike his usual personality that it kind of creeped her out. He must be tense because we're headed into the forest. How childish. She thought it was sweet and felt like his big sister. Thanks, NFI. Glad I can count on you. Now he's doing a side chest pose. What's that about? What? But we're not even. I brought a bunch of alchemical items, so yeah, you can leave it to me. Hit with another sparkle, Enri felt his sweetness level drop by about half. Sure, thanks. Yeah, thanks. Still, I'm not sure we really need to be doing something this dangerous. YGGDRASIL turned around to look at Enri with a sober face. She couldn't believe he was rehashing the same conversation they had had multiple times in the village, but she knew he was saying it out of concern for her safety, so she couldn't ignore him. But if we don't gather the herbs, we can't make that money. Couldn't we use animal skins instead? Those we can get well enough on our own. They aren't bad, but those herbs fetch the best price. The values of skins and herbs were completely different, night and day. Of course, an extremely rare animal might be worth a lot, but those were few and far between. Maybe you could have the boss man bring them back to you. The Balar household and mine have separate accounts. We'll work together and split the profits. I can't just take advantage of everyone all the time. Helping one another out was the village way of life. That was precisely why becoming ostracized left people without options. But relying on everyone else all the time was proof that a household couldn't make it on their own, and there was no way mooching would be tolerated. Self-sufficiency meant hard work. Behind them, Faria was saying, Kayari, can you read the atmosphere a bit and knock off the poses for now? And the pair averted their eyes. That's true. Yeah. But that means if you got together, you'd have a single account. Anyway, you won't cancel the trip, right? Jujumu's voice was gradually losing energy. He must have realized that she wasn't going to give up on the plan. Enri knew YGGDRASIL was worried about her and she didn't want to cause him trouble, but her resolve was unshakable. The reason she was heading into the forest despite knowing about the dangers was due to that remark Kayari had made about being unable to repair their gear. She might have been able to sharpen a knife, but mending iron gear would require a true blacksmith. In other words, the goblins were having a latent crisis. As their gear degraded, it put them that much more at risk. It was essential to have backup equipment. If they put their lives on the line and worshipped her as their master, what could Enri do in return? She couldn't just hole up in a safe place enjoying the fruits of their devotion. She concluded that she needed to do everything in her power to let them fight to their full potential at a moment's notice. The goblins were Enri's bodyguards, but they also protected Karn. Following that logic, she could probably tax the villagers to buy weapons for them, but she rejected that idea the moment it came into her head. She wanted to pay back her debt to the goblins personally. This foraging trip was, in a way, an expression of her sincerity and pride. We would have liked to have scouted the area before you go, the goblin mage Dano chimed in from behind. She wore the skull of some human-like creature. In her hand, she held a twisted staff that looked shabby but still taller than she was. Her body was heavily accessorized with peculiar tribal ornaments, and her chest had a slight swell to it. Looking at her face, Enri could distinguish a slight softness compared to the men. Enri was used to it but could still only barely make out the difference. An average human wouldn't be able to tell at all. But you have no idea what it's like, right? Yeah, unfortunately we don't know if it's safe or not. Even if we did go first, all we would be able to find out is whether the forest had calmed down or not, but that would still take time. If we wanted to know the new layout of territories within the forest, it would take longer. By then, the herbs they wanted to collect would be out of season. Hearing Dano's comments, Enri's strong will shone in her eyes. It's all right. I won't go in too deep, she said decisively. After repeating the same argument several times, YGGDRASIL understood that Enri wasn't going to change her mind. He gave up and turned to the 3 goblins who would be accompanying her. As expected, he said the same thing as before. We can't guard her, so you guys gotta protect her as our representatives. You too, boss man. Really, it would be safest for everyone to go together. Dividing our force is awfully foolish, grumbled Dano. But that would take too long otherwise, right? Yeah. If we don't shoo away the monsters heading toward the village and the creatures trying to establish territory nearby, there'll be trouble. Once they've built a nest, they won't leave, and even if they do leave temporarily, it's very likely they'd come back. With the changes in how the spheres of influence mapped across the woodlands, it was essential that they perform a search, especially in the areas near the village. They were readying for round 1 of this reconnaissance. As the first, it was the most dangerous. That's why they could spare only 3 goblins to escort Enri. Okay, then. Let's go. We gotta get this search over with and meet up with our boss lady. YGGDRASIL barked orders, and the goblin troop responded with a ferocious roar. Inside the woodlands. About 150 yards in, the temperature had dropped more than a couple of degrees simply because the sun's rays didn't reach the forest floor. That said, it wasn't completely dark, even Enri could see their surroundings fine. Wading through the crisp air as they went, the party of 5 advanced into the forest. For now, silence reigned over the woodlands. There were almost no sounds, besides the swaying of the treetops and the occasional echoing call of a bird or beast. Enri and her companion's footsteps felt loud in that quiet. The other party, headed by YGGDRASIL, must have gone far ahead, because they couldn't hear them anymore. Enri's group advanced in a wedge formation with Enri and Enri in the center. It was difficult to stay spread out in the forest, so a single file line would have been standard, but they insisted on the formation in order to protect the 2 humans. That slowed down their group, but they decided there was nothing they could do about that. When they got farther in and began heading north, Enri started glancing around. He was searching for treasures sleeping among the trees, herbs. Enri was no amateur when it came to herbs either. She knew quite a lot for a girl her age, which ones could be simply ingested orally, which ones were more suited for topical application, and which ones could be made into potions. But she didn't even come close to Enri. He had a profound knowledge of not only medicinal herbs, but also the ones that could be used for alchemy. Did you find a rare herb? When Enri asked, all the goblins started posing as if on cue. More double biceps poses. It must be the hip thing to do. Enri cocked her head. She didn't notice Enri's fed-up expression. Why didn't I tell them those signals were a bad idea? Being a chicken is the worst. So do you see that brownish moss over there? Sure enough, there was moss in the direction he was pointing. That's Bebeamoku moss. If you mix a bit of that into a potion, it makes the effects a little stronger. Wow, really? Looks like normal moss to me. Even now that you've pointed it out, I probably won't be able to spot it. You're amazing, NFI. You really are something, boss man. Is that a valuable herb? It's worth a fair amount, but, wait. We don't need to get that one. The herb Enri and I are after is worth a lot more. If we don't find much, we can always pick this one on the way back. Gotcha. Wow, but for someone like you, this mountain is a pile of treasure. It'd be easy for you to make a fortune with it. Anyone who chooses to be with you would be able to rest easy. I don't know about, the goblins changed poses. Maybe you're right. I'm pretty confident that I won't let my partner have a hard time in life. Yeah. You seem capable of that much, NFI. The atmosphere of the quiet forest grew awkward. Is that all, boss lady? What do you mean, Kayari? I mean, nothing. I meant to ask you earlier, what herb are you looking for? We didn't tell you. It's called Enkaishi. Nimue crushed up the rest of our supply. I see. Gotcha, not that us goblins can help spot it, though. Alright, let's keep moving. With each step, they wandered deeper into the woods where the heady scent of the forest tickled their noses. Once they were fully enveloped in this world devoid of people, a place where the humans realized how small and fragile they were, Enri spoke. Let's try looking around here. There's lots of shade, and the air is damp. There might be water nearby as well. This is where that type of herb normally grows. This spot doesn't seem to have been trampled by monsters either, so it's exactly what we're looking for. Gotcha, boss man. Enri was an apothecary with lots of herb gathering experience, so anything he said was probably correct. Both Enri and the goblins agreed. Everyone put down their packs to lighten their load. Boss lady, would you give boss man a hand? Oh yeah. He's carrying a lot for one person. She went over to Enri and capably assisted him as he set down his bags. Thanks, Enri. No worries, NFI. But wow, as a specialist, you sure have a lot of stuff to carry. You need so many things. She noticed the goblins nodding in satisfaction out of the corner of her eye. She didn't know what they were so happy about, but she decided to ignore it for the time being. Okay, let's start searching. With a slightly subdued yeah, the goblins set about guarding the area, and Enri and Enri began combing the area for herbs. Enri hadn't expected things to go very smoothly, but it was almost disappointingly easy to find Enkaishi. The herb grew so densely between the trees that it practically jumped out at them. Over there. I can't believe we found a bunch on our first try. It was definitely the right choice to have you come along, it had nothing to do with me. We're just lucky we found a spot that wasn't all messed up. It can be awful after a monster passes through. The large amount of herbs growing there wasn't exactly worth a fortune, but it would still net them a considerable sum. Enri frantically suppressed the greed flaring up inside her. They were in a dangerous place, so they needed to finish their work quickly without overreaching. She crouched down and picked the plants carefully at the base. The parts of the Enkaishi herb that had medicinal properties were near the roots, but that didn't mean Enri could simply pull up the entire plant. This herb had a lot of life energy, so if she left the roots alone, it would grow back over time. It took a little longer to pick the herbs carefully, but it would have been a shame to gather every last bit and ruin the cluster they'd only just located. The pungent smell that drifted up each time they plucked a plant didn't bother them once they got used to it. It was heaven compared to Enri's house. They foraged each herb one at a time and carefully packed them in the bags on their hips in a way that kept them from being crushed. It would have gone faster with the goblins' help, but they were keeping a vigilant watch. Enri wasn't foolish enough to ask them to pick herbs. Next to her, the motions of Enri's hands were superb. He moved so quickly but still picked the plants in a way that perfectly preserved the medicinal components. It was clear he had skills only a specialized professional could have. Enri watched him from the side in silence as he concentrated. He almost looked like someone else. He's really grown up. Is something wrong? Enri suddenly looked up. He must have sensed something was off because her hands had stopped moving. Enri looked down bashfully for no particular reason. I just was thinking how amazing you are. I don't think I'm all that. I'm barely an apothecary. Pretty sure this is normal. I wonder. I'm pretty sure. The conversation broke off there, and the herbs in their bags gradually piled up as time slowly passed. Their bags were a little more than half full when the goblins abruptly crouched down around the two of them as if to hide. Enri was startled, but Kayari gestured to her to be quiet. It's some kind of emergency. Once she realized the situation, she finally stopped moving and strained her ears. From very far away, she could hear the sound of something moving through the undergrowth. What is it? Something's coming this way. It could be aiming for us, but most likely, it just happens to be headed in this direction. First, let's pull back a little from this place. Would an item that could make a loud noise work as a decoy? No, boss man, I think we'd better not. Seems like it could backfire. Okay, let's go. The five of them moved away from the noise into the shadow of a nearby tree. The reason they didn't go farther was to avoid making too much noise tramping through the plants. If the incoming creature only happened to be traveling in their direction, they didn't need to risk being discovered. It wasn't a huge tree, so they weren't completely hidden, but they could at least flatten themselves against its roots so they didn't stick out too much. The five of them lay there waiting, holding their breath and praying that the creature would go in a different direction. Unfortunately, their wish didn't come true, and the creature appeared in the party's line of sight. Enri let a small yelp of surprise slip. It was a little beat-up goblin. There were small, bloody wounds all over its body. It was breathing heavily, covered in sweat and blood. Goblins were smaller than humans to begin with, but even taking that into account, this one was tiny. Her insights from living with goblins in her daily life told her she was looking at a child. The goblin child threw a fearful glance over its shoulder back in the direction it had run from. Without even straining her ears, she could hear something else coming through the brush. If the goblin she saw was being hunted, the other had to be the hunter. The goblin frantically worked its cramping legs to hide in the shade of a different tree from Enri and her companions. What? Please be quiet. Goku interrupted her, but his eyes never moved. He was keeping close watch on the direction the goblin child had fled from. Less than a minute later, the hunter appeared. It was a magical beast that resembled a huge black wolf. They could tell it was a magical beast because of the chains wrapped around it. The boa constrictor, like chains, didn't inhibit the beast at all, they practically seemed like an illusion. The creature also had two horns jutting out of its head. Enri whispered the beast's name. It's a Barghest. There was no way it was answering, but it snorted just like a dog would, and then sneered. The expression was sinister, impossible for a normal animal to make. The beast's eyes slowly scanned the area until they were looking in the direction of the tree where the goblin child had hidden. If the Barghest had a good nose to match its canine appearance, there was no way it would miss the scent of that much blood. It didn't seem like the goblin child had made it this far because of any ability to fend off the pursuer. The beast was either sadistic or hunting purely for sport. Suddenly the Barghest stopped, scrunched up its face in suspicion, then stared at the place where the herbs were growing thickly. Enri shrank back. The others did the same. Behind the tree, Enri opened her hands. Her skin was flecked with green. Enri was next to her looking at his hands, too. The sap from when we were picking herbs. Yes, the same intense odor as when Nemu had been crushing them. They had gotten used to it, so their noses didn't notice it anymore, but the intense smell must have been hanging in the air. Her racing heartbeat felt noisy. It's on the move. Looks like it's heading away from here. I guess it didn't notice him because of the stink. Listening with an ear against the tree, Enri seemed to have a question mark over his head. I guess it couldn't pinpoint him because of the smell? What do you mean, boss man? I'm pretty sure magical beasts have good noses, that's the point, said Enri, explaining his idea. Basically, because of the beast's keen sense of smell, it hadn't been able to pinpoint where the pungent smell was coming from. The scent on Enri's and Enri's hands and bags had mixed with the general smell of the location they had been picking in. And as a lucky bonus, their body odors must have also been covered up. It might have even viewed the crushed herbs as a last-ditch effort by the goblin child to hide. They had a lot to thank the powerful smell for, but it wasn't hard to imagine that if they ran, the smell might follow them and lure the Barghest. If that kid ends up being a sacrifice, then problem solved. As long as we don't know how strong that thing is, it's too risky to interfere. At those cool-headed words, Enri looked over at Goku in spite of herself. But it was a natural thing for him to say. The goblins' #1 priority was Enri's safety. Of course, they would want to avoid combat with that magical beast, even if they needed to sacrifice someone of their own race. There was nothing strange about his statement whatsoever, according to his beliefs. But Enri hated it. Isn't it wrong, as a human, to not save someone if you can? Even someone from a different race? Maybe it was just the foolish idea of a village girl who had never been attacked by goblins and lacked a sense of crisis. She looked at all the other goblins. They must have understood her feelings, but they kept their mouths shut. Next, she looked at Enri. "NFI," he sighed. "Let's save him. He might be a good source of information. If we don't find out why he ran all this way, the village might find itself in a tough spot later." The goblins furrowed their brows. "We might not be able to beat it, you know." "That's true. But Barghests come in all different strengths. I heard Barghest leaders are pretty powerful. From that one's chains and horns, though, it doesn't seem like it's too strong. I'm sure we could beat a normal Barghest. Hold your horses. The boss lady's here. We should avoid any danger." Enri swallowed. These were foolish words spoken for her own satisfaction that would put not only her own but other lives at risk. Still, she had to speak. Abandoning someone you might be able to save is like allying with the attacker. I don't want to be the kind of person who picks on the weak. Please. About the time Kairi looked at Enri's serious face and sighed in defeat, the magical beast made a strange noise. It was a bark that was clearly sneering. Next, they heard the goblin child scream. They no longer had time to hesitate or confer among themselves. "Guess we got no choice. Let's go." The goblins leaped out first. Enri followed. Watching the warriors go to battle to make her wish come true, Enri felt a tearing pain in her chest. "I can't do anything but watch from back here." The least she could do was watch so intently that she didn't even blink. The 4 who had charged out immediately caught sight of the Barghest, which had tackled the goblin child. The reason the young goblin had new wounds but wasn't dead had to be due to the Barghest's wicked desire to play with its prey. The Barghest stopped moving and looked between the new group and the goblin child. It probably thought it had just been led into a trap. "Hey there, puppy dog." Enri jerked a thumb at himself and said, "If you wanna play, I'll play with ya." "Come on," the Barghest growled with open hostility. Out in front, Kairi drew his machete from his hip in one smooth, natural motion. The other goblins followed suit. "Don't hold back. I'll teach you some tricks, like down." In response to the provocation, the goblin child pinned under the Barghest screamed. The beast didn't talk, but its actions spoke loudly. "If you move, I'll kill him." "But, okay. Let's slay this sucker." The 3 goblins ignored the beast's threat and charged. The Barghest's eyes wavered in confusion at the unexpected turn of events. The Barghest didn't know this, but the goblins hadn't really turned up to save the child. They had simply heard Enri's request and were invested on only the "it'd be great if we could save him" level. If they didn't kill the Barghest now that they'd faced it head-on, it was possible Enri, who was actually most important, could end up hurt as well. That's why they had to slay the beast once and for all. So actually, if it wanted to mess with the goblin child some more, that would mean it was taking pointless actions, which would help them out. Seeing the gleam of the 3 machetes, the Barghest stopped moving again, realizing the child wouldn't work as a hostage. It wondered whether or not it should finish off the small goblin. Ending his life would be extremely easy. It could kill the child in one bite. But while doing that, its enemy's weapons would definitely come slashing. The danger to the Barghest's life forced it to do one thing. Ignoring the child, it leaped to meet the goblin's attack. The Barghest was heavier than the goblin warriors. The plan was to take advantage of that to tackle them before ripping out their throats. But that immediately went awry. The goblin the Barghest aimed for nimbly dodged, and the other two sliced at it with their machetes from either side. The chains wrapped around its body blocked one of the attacks, but the other bit into flesh, spraying blood. At the same time, an open bottle came flying at its snout. The Barghest screamed at the awful stench that pierced its eyes and nose. The moment the beast stumbled to a halt, more pain assaulted it. The Barghest could tell from the blood flowing freely from open wounds that the fight was going poorly. With tears in its eyes and a wavering field of vision, the magical creature charged. It aimed at the one who'd thrown the bottle, a human. But the charge lasted only a few steps. The bottoms of its paws adhered to the ground and stayed there. Below, a bizarre slime was spread across the earth. The strange liquid didn't soak into the dirt at all. This doesn't have enough adhesive power to hold a strong magical beast. Let's attack it all at once,